biblical study. I mean, I think they're worried about flagging numbers. A lot of these more mainstream faiths. Wouldn't it be just a wonderful counterpoint to other things that are happening in the more fundamentalist evangelical communities, but also to kind of fill the vacuum for what they feel they're lacking? Wouldn't it be? Is that a credible thing to hope for, a movement amongst mainstream Protestants to engage the text in that way?
Not only is it credible, I mean, I think it's credible among people who have nothing to do with religious institutions. I mean, I spoke, for Seattle Arts and Lectures, there were nearly 2,000 people
Wow.
interested in these texts, but they weren't there to get,
A faith
to get preached to.
Yeah.
They were there to learn something about religious traditions. So there's a huge audience here in Seattle and all over the country for people interested in these issues, not just within the churches, but I think also within the churches. We need to learn why the differences are the way they are. I mean, just the whole exchange we had about, when is a Jew not a Jew, when is a Jew a Christian, I mean, when does that happen, and what are the marks by which people establish those boundaries? It's very bizarre to me that, that they mark it off this way.
No, absolutely, and I like the notion of really beginning to engage this in a practical sense. I mean, that's what we're hoping to do with this institute and these kinds of efforts. And I think it's again, this gets a little off subject, but I think that's it was a uniquely Seattle experience, but now I think it's a faith experience that's spreading across this country and Western Europe is a sense of kind of a spiritual connection to these texts and an interest in finding one's way, but a rejection of kind of the classic approaches and communities that have been the mainstay for how religious and faith ideals are expressed. I think those 2,000 people were there. Some of them out of an intellectual curiosity, but I think some of them also are trying to find a rational, modern connection and access to faith in ways that are comfortable to them because they've rejected it in other ways.
Absolutely, because I think questions of religious authority are what get raised if you study it this way. Well, who was John and who cares what he said? Questions of religious authority are very much on the mind. I mean, that's why many people have nothing to do with religious institutions, because why do I have to
follow this person's instructions?
Hear what that person says. And often they're not invited to think about it. And many people want to think about this. Even if they've rejected religion overtly, they're very much interested in it. So I think they should be part of the potential audience for what you do.
And I think particularly the Book of Revelation and your work on it is, the timing couldn't be.
This is a crazy book to be studying.
No, in some ways absolutely, but I think the timing can't be is great because I'm concerned about all of the religious
Yes.
resonances with Y2K. Now, I mean, the irony is this 2012 Mayan thing, I think, is going to bring out of the woodwork, the normal crackpots, but I think you're going to have a huge affluence of some of this thinking amongst, Christian communities, just with the notion of, kind of the Mayan calendar and that seeping into the popular culture. I think trying to have more of a scholarly understanding and appreciation, as you said, of Revelation for its metaphoric power, not for its literal template.
Yes, and you can also, intellectual interest isn't devoid of spiritual interest either. I mean, I love these other texts. I mean, I've come to understand more about how this book appeals, the Book of Revelation, and have reservations about it as you do. I share the same ones. But look at these other texts of Revelation which actually speak to me very much because they do speak about the presence of the divine in the universe in a very different way. And I think many people can recognize that.
And it's wonderful to see, particularly that so often we associate the Christian canon with a kind of parochialism and a kind of,
for lots of good reasons.
Yeah, and in a kind of bifurcated view of the world. But the notion that there were, some of these non-canonical, they didn't fit into the agenda of the times, but these non-canonical Christian texts, and there's some Jewish texts as well that have a much more, based on kind of Hellenistic wisdom literature, a much more universalistic embrace of what the end times are, what we're seeking. And to try to celebrate those more and as a counterweight to the dominance of Revelation, I think is important.
Well, there's a lot in, say, the Christian Gospels that speaks to a much wider issue than whether you're a Christian or not. I mean, I don't think Jesus was interested. I mean, wouldn't have even known what that meant since he wasn't a Christian. But there's a lot in those texts that speak to much more than religious affiliation. They speak about fundamental human values, you know. Do you feed the hungry? Do you visit those in prison? Do you care for the ones who are sick or not? Very simple. And, you know, basic ethics, or the famous statements about love God and your neighbor, which is straight out of Deuteronomy. So that's, you know, there's plenty in this tradition that can be deeply appreciated and valued spiritually as well as intellectually, if you focus on different sides of it, that I think we need to do now. Because these other kinds of schisms are just, could be catastrophic.
The last thing I want to ask you is something that we talked about just briefly before the presentation, and that is, do you think there is something inherent in human nature or something culturally that drives people to embrace these very dramatic and horrific apocalyptic and eschatological, you know, visions? You had mentioned before that you feel it's really plugged into, from a neurological, if not a psychological perspective, fear. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I was thinking about how religion works altogether. And I think in Christian tradition, belief is very much overrated. You know, I mean, you know, all of the sort of Dawkins, Hitchens stuff about do you believe in God? I mean, that's an intellectual propositions that absolutely don't reach people.
This is the point.
At the level where people engage. And I think we engage much more emotionally, but, you know, and this book functions that way. It appeals to hope and fear, both. And its appeal can be very pernicious. And there are aspects, there are ways of reading it that are not that way, I think. But I think we have to deal with these very primitive, fundamental emotions of hope and fear that give rise to a lot of other rationalization of religious beliefs and affiliations and political behavior.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I really
Well,
appreciate it.
I
It's
really
wonderful
enjoyed it.
having you.
I think we should talk